All right, let's bring in Brian Billick, Fox Sports, NFL Network analyst, of course, the former coach of the Ravens. What about the timing of the bounty story here? Make it worse because of the timing, or is this a bad story all around, no matter when it's revealed?
Yeah, I don't know if you were to ask when would have been a better time, depending upon what agenda you want to serve, the team, the league, the players, whatever. I don't know when that time would be. The fact that I think it has to come out now, because certainly if you're talking about sanctions going forward, you have to affect, if indeed one of the sanctions is going to be loss of draft choices, obviously getting into the free agency period, how players have the right to know, well, what am I coming into? What's the situation here? I don't know that there's any better time to do this.
How surprised are you that you saw this headline? What was your reaction?
Well, both surprised and inquisitive, because I think until we see the sanctions, we're not going to really know what was the purpose of this. Clearly, at the very least, you have to say Roger Goodell has been consistent in terms of the steps he's taken since becoming commissioner in terms of trying to protect the players, whether it's the head-to-head contact, the hitting the defenseless players, the backing off of certain practice regimen during the CBA. You can like it, you can not like it, you can think it is good or bad for the game, but at the very least, it is consistent, and it's putting the health of the players at a priority. And clearly there's no place in the game for this, to the degree that the accusations are saying that this is a willful intent to hurt the players. That's where it then becomes vague to me, because the very mentality of the game, the verbiage of the game, and now the word bounty is going to be all-encompassing, even to include those conversations in the locker room or in the meeting rooms with DBs going, okay, let's put $50 up to see who gets the first interception, who's going to get the first tackle, who gets the most hits on the quarterback, not with intent to injure, but the very nature of your job says I'm supposed to go tackle the quarterback, who can force a fumble. So there's a little ambiguity as to the verbiage that we're going to use. Right now, bounty is the last word you want to use in any of these.
That conversation come up in your locker room when you were with the Ravens?
Absolutely. And that's where it's going to be very difficult for the head coaches and the organizations as a whole, as walking that fine line. It may not be fair, and it may not be reasonable, but you as the head coach are going to be held accountable, as you always are, on everything that goes on in that organization. So the normal bravado, the testosterone-driven locker room that says, yeah, we're going to be aggressive, and yeah, we're going to do everything we can to win, but it has to draw that fine line. And I don't think when the majority of players would willfully try to injure someone, although certainly in the game, tempers can flare. But the mentality that clearly the league is worried about in terms of the locker room and the meeting rooms and that you take into a game, to remove any indication that anybody would willfully want to hurt somebody else, even if it's just the verbiage of what you're talking about, is the intent here. And I think the sanctions are going to be severe. Is it fair that it's just the New Orleans Saints? Probably not. But, hey, that's just life.
Did the Ravens have bounties?
You know what? As a head coach, I will tell you, and this is a difficult thing for me to answer, and easier for me now that I'm out of it compared to a coach that's currently in it. But there again, we go back and we use certain words. Anytime you talk about this, you have to be very conscious of how are those who are going to hear it filter it. There's talk that goes on in the locker room that the outsider would not understand, would think is malicious, vicious, have that willful intent, but not always. Sure, we had bounties in the terms that there was constantly challenging of one another. As I said, who's going to get the first interception? Who's going to get the most hit on the quarterback? Who's going to get the tackle inside the 20? Who's going to hit someone so violently that the ball comes out and causes a fumble? Yeah, players have been doing that for years. Certainly it existed when I was the head coach in the Baltimore Ravens and back when I was with the Minnesota Vikings. And you kind of embrace that mental attitude that, yeah, we're going to be aggressive, but at no point for me, and again, I had the good graces of being around maybe the most dominant single-season defense in the history of the game, with some dominant personalities, very physical, violent defensive team. But at no point did we sanction, or was I aware of anybody that thought, let's take this to the next level, and in the perspective of the longest yard, held up x-rays of a guy that had a broken leg 3 years ago and say, okay, this is where we want to hit the guy.
Were there financial incentives for some.
Oh yeah, you know that's constantly.
But where did that money come from?
That goes on among the players in that regard. I don't know that you're ever going to really regulate that. Certainly, to the degree I've never been around anywhere to the degree where it's alleged that the New Orleans Saints and the coaches involved actually put up the money or endorsed it in that way.
Because if all of a sudden, if you have Greg Williams putting up money, if Sean Payton's involved in it, if a business associate of Sean Payton's, that's when it's different here. Because what's to stop somebody who is a bookie going to a player and saying, I'll give you $100,000 if you put Peyton Manning out of the game, right?
Absolutely. There's nothing good that comes from the sanctioning of the organization in this regard. But again, I'll go back, and I'm not justifying it at all. We're hearing all the talk about it, and again, I'm just trying to bring a different perspective to make sure that the rhetoric that surrounds this, that those that are talking about it truly understand the filter. Those that are not, those that have been in the locker room and understand it certainly can comprehend what we're talking about. Those that haven't, it may be more difficult for them to cross that line. I think clearly part of this as well is, and the reason the league is coming down so hard on the New Orleans Saints, if this investigation was indeed going on to the point where it was addressed to the Saints, that they didn't feel like there was enough information initially in 2009 and 10 to pursue it, and then the Saints then continued on with it as though to say, well, we dodged a bullet here, or they don't really mean it, and then continued it on in 2011. I think that's where the severity of the sanctions is going to hit the most, both that arrogance and the fact of not recognizing, and I don't know this for a fact, but the league may have been saying, look, we're concerned about this. You need to back off that, and they did not.
Yeah. But if I have Greg Williams as the common denominator, he's with Sean Payton. He also works with Joe Gibbs. How do I have somebody who has a system in place without connecting this to the head coaches? Joe Gibbs, Hall of Famer, and Sean Payton.
Well, you're either going to be accused of being incompetent by not knowing about it, or willfully involved by sanctioning it. So there's no good side to this. If those coaches choose to say, and it's around the league as well, I wasn't aware this was going on, well, that's maybe as equally damning as saying, yeah, I was aware of it and I let it happen. You've got to be aware, like I said, it may not be fair, may not be reasonable, but you're going to be held accountable for all of this. And the thing going forward, I'm going to be fascinated to see what happens now, because Commissioner Goodell has kind of drawn a line in the sand when we're talking about the Spygate and the sanctions that came in terms of loss of draft choices, in terms of the monetary return that Bill Belichick had to have with regards to the sanctions. These sanctions, in my opinion, clearly that line's been drawn. They have to be north of that.
Worse, the bounties or Spygate?
Well, I think because you're talking about the safety of the players, certainly Spygate was serious in its own regard, but you're talking about the competitiveness of the game. With these bounties, you're talking about the health of the players. So just by the very definition of it, to go back to the culpability of the coach, let's take that Spygate into Josh McDaniels in Denver and what happened there. Well, if you weren't sanctioning it, at the very least then Josh McDaniel had to go back to every individual in that organization, player, coach, trainer, personnel, administrator, and say, what have I done in my actions in leading this team that would indicate to you that I would sanction such a thing? So the depth of this goes beyond just, hey, I didn't know it was going on, or I didn't know it was going on to that degree, and the fact that we're talking about the health of the players, and when you look at the sanctions that are happening to the players with the helmet-to-helmet, the repeat offenders, it clearly has to be north of the Spygate sanctions, I would believe.
Good to visit with you as always, Brian. Thanks for joining us.
All right, sounds good.
That's Brian Billick, NFL on Fox analyst. Twitter handle is at Coach Billick.